Hey, welcome back everyone here to Veteran Nation on NRN. And before we get started today, I want you to go to www.nrnplus.com/VN. Again, that's all spelled out, www.nrnplus.com/VN. That's our landing page. You can subscribe to our show. It's $9.95 for the month. It's $79.95 for the year. You're going to get access to the background stuff that we have for this show. You're going to get access to all the other NRN shows, all the great content. You'll be supporting independent journalists here at NRN. And with today's show, it's good to actually have an expert joining us today. Today, we've got Ashley Lubinsky, and she is a curator with the Cody Firearms Museum. And Ashley, how you doing today?
I'm doing really good. And I always laugh when people say expert because other people say that. But when I say that, then like it's a challenge. So you'll never hear that come out of my mouth.
Well, we're all experts in our one thing. I'm probably the only expert in my show here. So,
Or the Free Britney movement, apparently.
So you're joining us today, and we're going to talk about something that veterans absolutely love. It's one of our top things next to probably tattoos and bad decisions. It's guns.
Yup. I mean, I can sympathize with bad decisions, but not tattoos.
That's well, we have our things that are just important for us, so we jump on them whenever we can. This is one of those. In fact, I've got a group of friends right now who are off at the range. I didn't go this morning because I was a little bit hungover. I won't lie. I had a St. Patty's Day celebration yesterday, even though it's not quite St. Patty's Day yet. So they're all off shooting today. I'm here talking to you, so hopefully I can really learn some good things.
I'm just laughing that you're just hungover. I feel like I'm honored that you were able to grace me with your presence.
For me, I can, I've got a lot of freedom. I live out here in the desert in California. Everything out here is about freedom, just going where you want, doing what you want to do. So like all my buddies, they're literally probably somewhere out on county land, shooting a whole bunch of crazy crap. I normally like joining them, but today I wasn't feeling it.
Yeah, I like that you said California and freedom in the same sentence.
It's funny because I'm in one of those small pockets of California where we have a very good county leadership. We have a very good sheriff, in my opinion, and they offer us a lot of freedom. I'm actually one of the few people in California where if I apply for a concealed carry permit, I will probably get that approved.
Yeah, no, I know that. I always joke, but like I traveled around California enough. I remember one of the first times I went, I was going to meet one of the like prop and consultants on Western movies. And so I was staying in LA and then I drove out to their ranch. And it was just so funny because I was like, wait, first off, they upgraded me to like a convertible, which was actually a terrible idea for where I had to go. And, I'm going through these mountains and I'm like, wait a second, this looks like Wyoming. I don't know what's happening. So I've learned that firsthand. I've also, been out with a couple of prop houses out in the desert shooting some cool stuff too. So I am aware that there are good parts and very Western parts of California. Actually, it was the home and start of cowboy action shooting in the 80s. So it's kind of interesting. Some of the yin and yang of what happens in California.
It's funny because California, with how restrictive so much of it is, especially during COVID, we became the place to go. Like everybody started flocking out here just to get away from the oppressive restrictions in the cities. And next thing you know, we had stuff closed down, but they were finding all these ways to keep stuff going because there were just so many tourists here. Because they were like, you talk to these people and they're like, I had to get out of LA. I had to get out of LA. And it's like, yeah, that's how we would feel on a normal day in LA.
Well, and we in Arizona now, we got that same thing. A lot of California license plates in the past year.
The most popular in my county, the most popular bumper sticker is just simply go back to LA.
I have not seen one of those in Arizona, but I know that sentiment is shared by many.
That's yeah, it's just very repressive in a lot of areas. So it's good for me to be out here. The only thing is I get those 4 months out of the year where it's almost unbearable to live. You know, everyone becomes a hermit, and like you just don't see people out driving around or walking.
The unbearable is in like Phoenix hot.
Yes,
Okay.
it gets up to 112 quite frequently here.
Oh yeah. I actually moved. My husband's born and raised here, and I've been living between Arizona and Wyoming for years because the museum that I used to run, the Cody Firearms Museum, is in Wyoming. And I moved here full time, theoretically in the summer. COVID kind of inadvertently forced me to move here in the spring, but I hadn't, actually emptied out my duplex in Wyoming. And so my first summer here, it was horrible in terms of heat. It was like record, heat. And I was just like, and then our air conditioning broke.
That's I've lived out here off and on in the desert since 2009, and for a lot of that time I was active duty military, and of course they would pick me up and take me out to Afghanistan, brought me back, and then they sent me out to the United Arab Emirates. So it was like, okay, I was just going from one desert to another. It was like, I'm already acclimatized, don't have to deal with any of that stuff. So for me it's been good, but it takes a couple years of living out here to really get used to it.
Yeah, it's true.
So you talked about the museum, and that's just completely dedicated to firearms, correct?
Yeah, so the Cody Firearms Museum is actually a part of a larger complex. It's called the Buffalo Bill Center of the West, and there are 5 museums: Whitney Western Art Museum, Draper Natural History Museum, Buffalo Bill Museum, because the town Cody, Wyoming was founded by William F. Cody, Buffalo Bill,
Mhm.
And then the Firearms Museum and the Plains Indian Museum, and then we have a full-scale research library. And so the Firearms Museum in and of itself, it's in a wing within the larger organization, and it's about 40,000 square feet over 2 floors. And so right now I'm actually the curator emerita, which is essentially paid retirement through the museum. I've been with the museum for about a decade. I started coming out to the museum when I was in graduate school. And I actually worked between there and the Smithsonian for a while because they're affiliated. And so, yeah, that one I was just in charge of all the guns and random accoutrements. We had some like chocolate in the collection for a while. And then I also oversaw the museum got a full-scale renovation, multi-million-dollar renovation that reopened in July of 2019. So I oversaw all of that. Then I hung around for an extra year to make sure that all the donations came through, that everything was working, operating, correctly. So that didn't look like I finished the museum and they just ran off and let the chaos ensue afterwards. And then now I've just been helping out. I run their social media accounts. I plan all of our academic and online symposia series. And then I just kind of, right now, my assistant is now the curator. So I'm just helping him with the transition.
And your background is in history,
Yes.
correct?
Firearms history
And that's what kind of brought you to this. And you've been brought in to a couple different to be a witness in several gun lawsuits based upon your knowledge, correct?
Yeah, that's been the most interesting thing. So, my background is firearms history, and just a little, for the academic moment of it, that I promise I'll try not to use words like obfuscate throughout the rest of this. But basically, I study.
I'm a Marine, but I can say I know that word.
Yeah, I love that word. Also, academics totally make up words all the time, so you may hear that. We like the word problematize, although Microsoft Word does not. But yeah, so my background is in. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, us Marines, we make up words like orientate.
Well, there you go. So it crosses multiple disciplines. But my area of study is it's a macro historical approach to studying how firearms technology has evolved since the earliest iterations of firearms and cannons and projectile weaponry, and then all the way up through modern day, and how the different transitions in technology impact legislation, impact culture, society, industries. So I'm very much in the world between technology and social history. Mm-hmm. And actually in graduate school, I studied armed feminism and female African-American civil rights activism, which is like super, super, super leftist firearms activism in the 60s and 70s that like nobody knows existed anymore. Mm-hmm. So I've studied various different categories and timeframes. And so the first cases I actually got involved with were product liability cases, which I know, like, super, super sexy, right? And it was interesting because the first case that I worked on was actually surrounding the Ruger old model single action revolver. So I wrote a testimony on the technology behind cold type single actions, also, safeties that were and were not available around the time of the original invention, and then Bill Ruger's involvement in developing safety technology for revolvers, which ultimately were called the new model revolvers. But, as I was working for Ruger, I was on the defendant's side, so I had to respond to an engineer's expert witness testimony. And so when you're the defendant's side, you have to respond to as the expert rather than just writing a testimony for the most part. And so it was interesting because I was like, man, I don't know if I can go head to head with an engineer. I mean, I understand technology, but not to that level. And what was the most fascinating thing was I, drafted up something that I, beforehand that I anticipated was going to come my way once the, report came in. And as a historian, I was actually really shocked at how little they were aware of things that were available during that time period. And of course, with my background, my, opinion is that it didn't matter ultimately because it was for very different types of technologies. But, it was interesting to me because their engineers bring their own specific type of expertise, but they were completely unaware and oblivious to things that personally I could have, defended, 6 ways to Sunday, but at the same time, it would have helped their argument in the long run, and they just were completely unaware of it. So I think it's interesting, and I think I found a weird niche in this world where providing the historical significance of certain things actually does have a role. And so I've been working now more recently, although I do still work in product liability, trade dress, all that sexy gun industry stuff. But then I've also started writing testimonies for different Second Amendment cases. And one of them more recently, which you can find my testimony on the Firearms Policy Coalition's website, is on the Miller v. Becerra case, which is the current assault weapons case, although there's many now popping up around the country. The current case that's being tried. And then I also recently worked on, and all my testimonies can be found on the FPC website. I worked on the Gatas v. the BATF as well on the bump stock case. So I get pulled in, especially when people are trying to regulate the terminology that gets brought up a lot because of multiple cases throughout the 20th century are unusually dangerous and not in common use. Those are the two that you see a lot. It translate to these other cases. And so a lot of these laws that are put into place, the arguments behind them are that these are, unusual and not in common use. And so when I get brought into it, it's not about how I feel about the case per se, but it's about providing a historical background that these things and a lot of the technologies have been around for at least 150 years, if not longer. And so I just kind of provide the most boring part of the testimony, which is that, here are these things, here are these technologies. They've been around for a really long time. They haven't been regulated, until recently. And they've been in common use before. So why now versus, why not previously? And so that's where, my expertise comes in. And it's been interesting because I actually, my testimony ends up being very non-combative than some of the ones are because, a lot of times the other side's actually really interested because they had no idea about a lot of the stuff that, existed historically. And so that's kind of where my niche has come about during these cases is, what's the historical lineage? Does it have relevance today? I just talked for a really long time. I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. This is the type of stuff our viewers want to know about because, there's, as everyone knows, there's a couple new House resolutions that just passed. So we could be seeing a lot more gun legislation coming down the pike. I live in California, which is a state that has a lot of gun regulation. And, as someone who wants to be a law-abiding citizen, it becomes very hard because, you start talking to people and, especially the gun shops, and you have to ask so many questions of, okay, well, what can I do? What can I not do? What, where are my limitations of owning this weapon? Because, the last thing you want is for something to happen, the police have to come into your house to, you know, not even to confiscate a gun, to even just look, because they, you know that you have one, and next thing you know, you're being taken away in cuffs, even though you've tried to be a law-abiding citizen.
Yeah, I remember, I started off, as an academic. And so I didn't really own guns, know about guns, wasn't a concealed carry person until really I moved to Wyoming. I went to undergrad and grad school in Delaware. So it was not the easiest. I don't think you could, because I was a Pennsylvania resident. So, and so I had my concealed carry. I had taken NRA First Steps courses. I learned how to shoot historic guns, modern guns, because firearms are one of those things that, even as an academic and you're studying the history of it, the technology is so complicated that unless you actually go out there and try to shoot the stuff, so much of the research that's being done in the academic community, one, is very, very biased. It tends to be more political history, legislative history, and it's usually like massively inaccurate in terms of the actual technologies. And one of the things that I work really hard with is I actually have a really good relationship with the mainstream media. I have a really good relationship with, academics who hate firearms, because I, don't judge where they're coming from. And a lot of people come from a place of extreme ignorance and not necessarily malice, although there are obviously certainly people that do come from that area. But because of that, my goal with a lot of the education that I do in the academic community is to say, okay, so you're not actually accurate in the way that you're describing how these things operated, or, who they affected. And so now that you know that, does it change your conclusions at all? And that's something that I try to get people to really kind of think about. But when I first got into it, I was not, really a gun person. And so I, slowly became, more and more versed in firearms. I actually have a couple of instructor certifications, but like a good academic, it's not really so that I can teach, it's so that I can have a collection of certifications. But I do have my instructor certification, NRA, with, basic pistol, and then personal protection inside the home. And so I will probably end up getting more of those, because it also was a great learning experience for me. But I remember moving from Pittsburgh to Wyoming and having to like trace, the states I was going through, and making sure that, as I transported my firearms. And, it's just one of those things that if you're not in that world or immersed in that world, you have no idea how absolutely complicated it is, and how unfortunately easy it is to inadvertently break the law because, you happen to be in the backwoods of some state. And now all of a sudden, you're like Pennsylvania and Maryland, like if you're driving through the hills of Pennsylvania, all of a sudden you're in Maryland or Delaware and you don't even realize it, and so it's really complicated not coming from that world. I try to explain that to people, but I think it's one of those things, until you do it, you don't really understand it.
No, I definitely understand that, because, for me, I like the history side of things. My degree is actually in journalism, so I appreciate how you interact with journalists, because I've found, just in talking with a lot of journalists, on many different subjects, they really haven't done much research. And I'll give it an example on guns. I've talked to a couple journalists who said, well, you just want the gunfight at the OK Corral. And I'm like, hold on a second. You just used a historical thing. You do realize that was about disarming people, like that case. And they're like, oh, is that what that was? And like, so they use things off the cuff without really understanding it. And when you talk about, wanting to be within the confines of the law, it immediately brings to mind a couple cases out of New York State of people who were flying to other states. Their plane got diverted to LaGuardia. They land and try to fly out again. Their stuff goes through, and now all of a sudden they're arrested and in violation of New York state law, when they weren't even trying to go anywhere near New York. They were trying to go up to, Bangor, Maine or wherever. But just because they, and they had everything all separated in their checked luggage, but because they had it, it was, they were in violation of laws that they weren't even trying to be in the area that, presides over.
Yeah. And the unfortunate part of a lot of, misinformation from different organizations is that it's not like the good information is not readily available.
Yep.
There's no, so in the United States, it's kind of funny because, people always think that we have this great gun culture, but then when you look at Europe, who doesn't have the gun culture, they tend to be a lot more open-minded about having firearms related academic programming.
Mm-hmm.
And there's, firearms museum licenses in a lot of countries. Whereas in the United States, if you're a non-government museum, you are essentially a civilian unless you have an FFL. And so you have to abide by all your state, local, federal laws. And so in some ways, it's kind of reversed in our community. And as a result, there's nowhere where you can go and get a firearms history degree. You have to kind of make it for yourself within, the different programs, which I did do a lot of independent studies. But unfortunately, there's not good information out there because most of the information out there is more high level and less technical. And then the technical things that you get out there are collector, written, and there's no peer-reviewed vetting system there. So some of the collector's work is amazing, but if you don't know what you're looking at, how do you then know what's amazing and what's totally, made up gun lore? Because that gets published a lot. And so it's really, really difficult. And so one of the things, I'm also a representative for the DC Project, which is a nonpartisan nonprofit that represents women across the country from every state. We go to DC, we speak with legislators, both Democrat and Republican, about current, laws that are being proposed and how that affects gun owners. And one of the things that I was disappointed in general was that Democrat and Republican politicians or their staffers have no concept of firearms for the most part. But they don't have, when they get a bill coming to them, they, then ask their researchers to do the research, and then they have to go to things that are considered good sources. But a lot of those considered good sources don't actually have people who understand firearms. So they're not able to access solid research that provides them with more clarity when making, those policies and legislations. We've created an association and a symposia series. And also there's an academic journal coming out, which I can't say what it is just yet. It is a peer-reviewed firearms academic journal. We're trying to create that scholarship now to try to impact the future because it's, to some extent, it's not possible for people to, I can't talk to everybody. I mean, I know I talk fast, but I can't talk to everybody. And there's only, a small group of us in the country that know this information. And so it's really, really hard for anybody, regardless of what side of the aisle you're on, to get information that is helpful. And I think too, that is why so many current bills are so problematic, because it comes from a place of not fully understanding. And I'm specifically speaking about feature-based firearms regulations like assault weapons bans or capacity magazine bans, because it's coming from a place of not really knowing what you're trying to regulate while trying to regulate something, but not outright banning it. And if you've got staffers trying to do that research and they can't access any of that information because it's just not there, it's a cluster. I mean, it really is.
I can absolutely empathize with that because, coming from the military, for instance, assault weapon in the military, we have a definition for that. And it is not the way it's used in the media, and it's not how most civilians use that term. So, when you're dealing with across the board type of legislation, I can see where it very much muddies the water. Now, for people who have historical weapons, it affects them, correct? Them as well, correct?
Yeah, to some extent, with past legislation, it's kind of interesting because with the National Firearms Act of 1934, there's a misconception today that means that machine guns are completely banned in the United States, which is not the case. It's just post-86 machine guns for the civilian market. But what was interesting was when the National Firearms Act was implemented, regulating lots of things, but for the most part, machine guns, short-barreled firearms, as well as suppressors/silencers, is actually what the law says. And so those things didn't outright ban those types of firearms. They highly regulated them with a $200 tax stamp for the most part. There's some, different things with that we won't get into. And $200 back then was a lot of money. I mean, it's still a lot of money for a lot of people today, but especially coming out of the Great Depression. That's a ton of money, but it did allow for those things to exist and be owned by civilians in the country. But what's interesting is that when the Hughes Amendment got in place during FOPA, which is my favorite acronym, in 1986, what they ended up doing was creating this finite market of machine guns that can be in the United States because there's no current registry. There was an amnesty in 68 that allowed you to register your firearms when people found a lot of firearms that they could register, but there is no current registry. So if you find something in your closet, you should probably call your attorney. But it created a finite market, which also then drove the price of machine guns in the country way, way, way up, which also limits the ability for people of different classes to get their hands on certain types of technology.
Also creates a black market.
Yeah, well, yeah. But it creates this incredibly large collector market where, like, if you want a Thompson submachine gun, you're probably paying tens of thousands of dollars, if not more, depending on the provenance and the condition of it. And so it was interesting because I don't think legislators, when they were planning the Hughes Amendment, realized, what they were creating in that. And so it does, ultimately affect those things. And then if I remember correctly, and I'm probably going to be wrong in the HR blah, 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 because I'm not tracking it, but there's HR 127, and then I want to say it's like 167. And they're actually starting to target collectors point blank. I can talk in a second about how museums and collectors are, kind of, also affected by current laws that don't necessarily go after collectors outright. But these ones are actually trying to discuss the transfer of, private firearms, which I know 1446 is doing as well, but defining the term, of what people can collect and what they can't collect, and then how they can collect, and the justification behind that, and how they go about, justifying their collection, which will affect museums that are non-government entities until there is some kind of license or amnesty for museums in the United States. And so it's interesting that for a long time, people just didn't think about us because we're super boring, and we're probably the least likely to cause an issue, in the country. And then a lot of people think museums have amnesties, which is awkward when I'm consulting with other museums and tell them they don't. And so there's a lot of kind of ways that we get, lumped in with other laws, like universal background checks. But then, now it looks like they're actually starting to realize that this collecting market is a large thing and you can acquire a lot of these things, and that they also operate the same as lots of modern technology that they're currently regulating. According to the Gun Control Act of 1968, firearm, with the exception of machine guns made before 1898, for the most part, are considered antiques and not federally firearms. Semi-automatic technology was developed in the 1880s. So.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Aren't most revolvers nowadays considered semi-automatic because it puts the bullet in the position? No? Okay.
No.
I heard that.
It's the self-loading. I mean, yeah, the cylinder rotates if you've got a double action, but you are still, it depends on the revolver, but like if you're thinking about a single action, you've got to manually cock the hammer back. But if it's a double action, your finger on the trigger is still operating that in order for it to continue to move. The term semi-automatic tends to, focus on the self-loading component of it, which is to load the round, from the magazine into the breech, into the chamber, and then, ejecting that cartridge. And so it's a gas-operated system, blowback systems. So it's not considered the same thing. Although maybe in California law, I might be forgetting one of the many things that they could, because what people don't realize is that in the California assault weapons ban that's currently in place, revolving shotguns are regulated as well.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, that's, I'm more amazed when I find parts of guns here in California that are not regulated at this point. In fact, as much as regulation is as there is on guns here in California, carrying of knives is probably the loosest of any other state. Like California,
oh, wow.
Yeah, you can open carry almost any size knife and be just fine. So if you want a ninja sword, you can open carry here.
It's really interesting. That's one of the areas that like I am aware is equally as complicated as firearms in a lot of states, but know very little about, knife laws. I know that there's a lot of crossovers with lobbying groups for knife rights, but like I remember like the first time I heard about all of the regulations that exist in certain cities. And that's one of the things I'll always say, like, you won't ever hear me on the record talking about anything other than firearms because I know how complicated this is. I'm not even going to pretend that I know anything. I could possibly have the capacity to know another topic, as in depth as I know firearms, and I still know that there's a ton I don't know. So I don't even try to make public declarations on anything other than than firearms because it's just going to end up biting me in the ass.
What, most of our audience, are veterans who are very knowledgeable about weapons in general. Maybe not experts, but, we're trained to be able to disassemble most of our weapons and put them right back together again. Obviously, we're not gunsmiths, but what do you think our audience would be probably surprised to know about certain weapons? Is there one that, you're like, hey, there's this one out here that historically you were kind of alluding to, like this is considered an antique weapon. Any specifics that you can come up with?
So many thoughts on that. I guess I'll start with the broad and then we can speak more specifically. But the term that's like really popular right now in the media is what military style assault weapons or something like that.
Military
and then weapons of war get brought up a lot. And what I have actually written in multiple of my testimonies before I get into the nitty gritty of different like features that are regulated is the kind of overall history of firearms and the, kind of fluid nature between the civilian and the military market. And what's interesting is by, creating rhetoric's fun. I don't like rhetoric on either side half the time, but, you create rhetoric because people need things to latch on to, so they can, because I was sitting next to a lady on the plane from Cody once, and she asked me what I did. And so I said, Cody Firearms Museum. And she goes, oh, I don't have a problem with guns, but I don't think that weapons of war should be on our streets. And and then I was like, never mind. Because a lot of times people feel very strongly in using that, terminology. But historically speaking, the civilian market has always had better firearms than the military, since the earliest technology. For example, rifling was developed, they think, around the latter half of the 1400s. And I think the oldest firearm they know of is from the 1530s. But rifling has existed for about as long as firearms technology has existed as well. But it wasn't cost effective or feasible on the battlefield until the mid 1800s. And the reason for that was because the type of ammunition you were using was a round ball. And when you are using a round ball with rifling, it has to fit very snugly in order for it to be, make sense for it. And so as a result, military soldiers continued using smoothbore, not rifled firearms for infantry for a really long time. And rifling, was really only like a niche thing that people were using, and not as often as people think they were using it. And so, rifles were a product of the civilian market immediately. Because it was just easier for a one-off case for you to have a rifle for target shooting, for hunting. And essentially, as soon as firearms technology became a thing for the military, shooting sports competitions date to the 1400s, early 1500s. And so this civilian market is incredibly rich and tends to be better than what the military has access to. I think people always say like the military is like 30 years behind. Look at the Civil War. So now they have rifled muskets because they've got a conically shaped projectile, but they haven't changed the tactics. So it's kind of irrelevant, for a while. And then at the same time, they have access to all these repeaters, but the government's like, no, I don't think that we're ready for this technology. And so they've got, single shots, up through the Plains Indian Wars. And so, the military is always behind. So you've got better firearms on the civilian market, historically and up through today. And now it's kind of done a flip flop where the military is like, oh, target shooters, what can we take from, what you guys are doing, which, increase speed and accuracy. So there's that. And then there's also the fact that then military surplus is always sold back to the civilian market and, has been for, hundreds of years and still is today. And there's no precision in the term weapons of war. So what do you mean? Do you mean an M1 Garand? Do you mean a fully automatic firearm, which, also ironically is not in civilian hands post 86, so it's such a difficult, like talking point. And then in using the talking point and doubling down on the talking point, you're actually making a case for the civilian market to have better firearms than what the military has. And so it's like, that drives me nuts, because it's just like, people are so strong in the use of those terms, and they have zero concept for the fact that they're actually making an argument for the other side. And it also means nothing. It's a nothing term,
I love when people say military grade, because like, you do realize you're talking about the very cheapest that the government can buy.
Yeah, right. Like, yeah, like the
they're going to go with the
like,
cheapest one available. So when people are like, "Oh yeah, it's a military grade round," I'm like, "Okay, yeah." So you're bragging that you bought a cheap round.
Yeah. So that's one of them. And then, if you look all the way down, and I won't bore you guys enough to go through all of this, but if you look at various assault weapons bans, pretty much anything that's listed there is centuries old. And ones that aren't centuries old are things that came about because of regulation of things that are centuries old. Like pistol grip, and the thumb hole stock. But the concept for both of those have been around for centuries in terms of balancing a firearm for more accuracy. But what's interesting about all of those things is what I feel like most people think that an assault weapons ban actually bans an outright platform, and it doesn't. So the big categories that you always see with assault weapons bans are semi-automatic technology, and as I've said previously, semi-automatic technology dates to the 1880s. So that's not new. They also then reference center fire technology, and center fire technology is earlier than that. It's early to mid 1800s. Cartridge firearms, around the same time. And then, it starts with that. Detachable magazine tends to pop up, and detachable magazines, magazines in general have been around since the 1600s. And then magazines that we think of more modern, like box magazines, detachable magazines, are, 1850s. So they start with all of that. But then they're not saying you can't have semi-automatic center fire firearms. They're saying you can have featureless versions, or versions with one feature and not other features. So it really just devolves into this. Okay, so why is it like one of those features okay, and why is this technology completely okay if you don't have these things? When you think about it, if you look at, just because you have these features doesn't, having those features doesn't change the action of the firearm ultimately. And then, the features may provide you with the ability to have more accuracy, but it's not a guarantee. It goes to ability and levels, and a lot of these features actually help people who have different abilities, or people who are in wheelchairs. Like suppressors are incredibly helpful with that. I am vertically challenged. I'm 100 pounds and 5 feet. So for me, a stock that is able to telescope is, of value to me, but it doesn't necessarily mean I'm accurate or good with it. So it's this interesting thing that ultimately doesn't regulate what they say it regulates. And a lot of this comes from, especially in the case of California, they started trying to regulate specific firearms. Roberti Roos is the first one that often, that gets referenced. And that one did have a list. And then they needed to expand that list. And then they realized, okay, this is never ending, and someone's always going to come up with something else, kind of like the California handgun roster.
I think in some cases, didn't they just rename the gun? Hey, it's this now.
So then they switched over to features. Yeah. And then they switched over to features, and then there have been loopholes in features, and it basically comes down to like, when does this end? And this idea of banning firearms specifically and then features is really a more modern concept. And, yes, Emperor Maximilian II did ban wheel locks, but, back in the 1500s, but at the same time, that was not normal. The normal regulations on firearms up until the 1860s was to outright ban people. They were not mincing their words when they were banning it. I mean, early colonial settlements would, I think the wording on one of them is, Indians, mulattoes, and free blacks. were not allowed to own firearms. So they specifically said these are people who can't own firearms, and that continued, into the forming of the United States, all the way up through when you get the end of the Civil War and the Civil Rights Act of 1866, and then in the 14th Amendment. It's all happening around the same time, and now you legally can't ban people, so you have to be creative to keep firearms out of a specific class of person. So now the Civil Rights Act says you can't say, and this is 1866. There's many Civil Rights Acts, but now you can't say Black people can't own firearms, but that's the beginning of Army, Navy, and Saturday Night Special laws, where, okay, so we can't ban people, but we can now say the only types of handguns that you can have in certain states in the South are Army, Navy models, which happen to be expensive, and so now a whole class of people, not just a specific race, but a whole class of people are now not able to own firearms. And so this idea of almost passive aggressively, moving the needle occurs in the late 19th century, and it continues with fees and permits and tax stamps. And now we're regulating firearms. And then when firearms get too complicated, we're trying to regulate features because we can't ever regulate the whole thing. And it almost spirals out of control in the 20th century, and it's still going on today. I remember.
Ties into a case that I've been watching. The case is Martinez versus Villanueva, which is in LA County. And pretty much when COVID first hit, what happened was LA County started locking down things. And the LA County sheriff for about a week said gun stores are closed. They are non-essential. And the problem with that is California has all these laws where if I want to sell just anyone else my gun, I have to go to a gun store, do a background check. The gun store holds onto the weapon. We do all the paperwork, and then the transfer occurs. The problem with that is when you close gun stores, now there's no gun transfers that can occur, which also in California, that now is violating the case of Teixeira versus Alameda, which in that one they banned a gun store and said, no, you can't put this gun store in and they said it wasn't restrictive because there were other gun stores in the city. And the Ninth Circuit said, look, buying and selling is absolutely a part of the Second Amendment. They affirmed that. And they said, because you have other places to go, it's not within the city. It's not, it's not a ban to ban this one store. And now you have this case in LA where for a week, pretty much if you lived in LA County, you were completely unable to buy any type of weapons and were denied your Second Amendment for about a week before they got sued and then said, okay, yeah, we're backing off, but the case is still going. I don't know if you familiarized with that case or have dealt with any others similar.
So I think that when you mentioned this offline, the first thing I searched was what happened during the Spanish flu epidemic, and did we regulate anything? I couldn't find in my quick, Google search. I couldn't find anything, but at the same time, that was before the federal government was trying to, in the early 1900s, the federal government was trying to stop the South from keeping Black people from owning guns. So there were things that did pop up. And then it started going to feature-based, firearm systems and types of firearms. But, NFA is your first real big one. And so that's a little early for that. But the one thing I did find, which I thought was interesting, there's an academic article on the fact that more people were killed by the Spanish flu than because if you remember, you're ending up with the end of World War I, and more people were killed by the Spanish flu than in combat through like machine guns. And I just thought that was interesting. I was like, well, that's kind of crazy. I mean, I might be like misquoting that a little bit, but it was something to do with machine guns and casualty rates. Maybe it was back in, America, but, and the war and like actually looking at, the spread of the pandemic or epidemic and, overseas. So that's about as far as I got because I just totally rabbit holed into something that was completely separate, but I was like, this is really interesting. I'm going to look and see if anybody tried to do anything, with firearms, because I'm not aware if during other moments of epidemics in our history, have we tried to buy up firearms like we're buying up firearms now? The government definitely hoards in times of emergency as well, historically speaking. And so it's just, to me, that was interesting. And the whole COVID thing has been really beyond me to some extent in terms of, the way that they're going about with, determining essential businesses and how firearms played in that. And I just know that like the National Shooting Sports Foundation was actively involved in that. But, I was just trying to make it through being stuck at home for as long as I was. My husband's president of an ammo company. So, and he's a professional 3-gunner. So we fine,
Well, we're going to need those guns if there's another toilet paper shortage. That's for sure.
Right. It's been this whole thing has been fascinating. And, it's been a whole, and this is the one thing I'm going to say beyond firearms. So if I'm wrong, I'm already going to admit that I'm going to say mea culpa if I'm wrong. But, the whole thing has been an interesting exercise in, government authority and what is and is not acceptable across the board. I think at least it's been really interesting as someone who I despise politics. I don't engage in them. When I serve as an expert witness on these cases, it is not about how I feel. Obviously I have personal opinions about the Sullivan's Band case or the bump stock case, but it is about what I was asked to, report on and whether or not the rationales behind these things are historically sound. And so that, like, I don't even get political in that realm because it's, here's what you've asked me to talk about and this is the history and here it is, and so it's been fascinating to me because I don't follow most of that stuff. And, to see it all play out has been enlightening and then also exhausting.
Yeah, some of the legislation out there is it's fascinating. Also, I'm sure you probably would agree when you start looking into some of this stuff, how it came about. Like what immediately comes to mind was trench guns. There's so many laws out there about, how long can my shotgun be, things like that. And it's like, do I really want a shotgun that short? That type of thing. And it's like, you go back and you start reading and you're like, oh, okay. So this is what the back and forth was. It'll be interesting to see what comes out of this situation.
Yeah.
Because like you said, it's that whole, where is government? Where's the line going to be? And what, where's the pushback? Where's the pendulum going to swing? That type of thing.
Well, and what's interesting about the short barreled gun conversation is that, the handguns were initially in the NFA. And so Danny, now the curator of Cody Firearms Museum, and I have this theory that, short barreled guns were just a spillover of when handguns got taken out, they got left in. And then another Miller in 1939, I think, reinforced that. But it's interesting too, that conversation of what's concealable. Actually, that was concealability with the wheel lock back in the 1500s was the concern. Because you didn't have an open flame source like you have with matchlocks. So you were theoretically able to conceal your wheel lock way better, although they were like that big. But people also wore longer garments, I think. I am not a clothing historian, so don't quote me on that. But the short barrel thing, and then the ability
dueling has gone way down since then too.
What's that?
Dueling has gone way down since then.
And dueling was always illegal.
Yeah.
People never talk about that. Like, people don't even, I guess maybe with Hamilton they do the musical, but a lot of people don't realize that dueling was illegal and you could be convicted of murder if you actually killed someone in a duel. Fun fact.
Yeah,
fact. I always say fun fact, and it's like the most morbid thing I've said, all this interview. Fun fact: if you killed somebody in a duel, you were murdered.
Even dueling. Most duels they would shoot up in the air because it was more of a gentleman's way of dealing with it. But even that was against the law. And I think in the case of Burr, they actually went across the river so that it was more or less restrictive in because I think they were in New Jersey than New York.
I don't know about the restrictions back then, but the shooting into the air thing, I thought that's where you were going with the Hamilton Burr thing, because that is not proven. I don't know.
Not in that case.
That one's, yeah, but also, I mean, a lot like they were smoothbore guns, so like you didn't need to shoot in the air. The likelihood of you hitting somebody was slim to none. And they've done some studies with a similar type of firearm that Hamilton would have, Hamilton would have had, and where the bullet lodged in the tree, could have gone either way. But I mean, let's not give people that much credit. The what happened a lot with duels is you would take your first shot, it wouldn't hit. And then you had the choice to say, are we good? We good here? And so that happened a lot because you weren't supposed to have a rifled gun, although people did. Or they would have a rifled gun and then make it look smoothbore from the outs, right from the muzzle.
Mhm.
But you weren't supposed to have a rifled gun. So you were dealing with a smoothbore gun at distance, which meant, you probably weren't going to kill somebody. And then, you did have the option to stop the duel before you before you reloaded and took another shot. So you were able to be like, I think we're good. Never mind. There was actually a duel with rifles on Capitol Hill with congressmen back in.
Oh, wow. I'll have to look into that one. I've never heard that.
If you look up the congressman duel on the Hill, I think Smithsonian has a good write up because they actually have the firearms from it in their hall.
I don't know if dueling is going to make a comeback. It could, especially if it's over toilet paper.
You know what could make a comeback? Remember when that guy? Oh gosh, now I'm going to like butcher Civil War history and because I can't remember it. But like the big fight with the politicians where the guy came in and just like beat the crap out of somebody. I feel like that could come back.
Oh yeah, with his cane.
Yeah.
Was that Thaddeus Stevens?
No, I'm not even gonna guess. It's like one of the things you learn in like high school history, and it's totally escaped my brain, but I can't jam it all up in there. Some of it has to come out.
Oh, I'm the same way. It's I pick things up, and especially Civil War. I lived out in Virginia for a while, so I traveled around to a lot of Civil War battlefields just to learn different stuff. And there's some really fascinating things out there. Me in the military, I was a logistician. So like when people start talking about different things, like you talk about guns and you talk about magazines, immediately mine goes to, okay, our current military, how many magazines can I give a modern soldier before he's just way too weighed down? Where's that limit? So like things like that is what I think of, because I was in combat and that was the type of things we had to deal with. Okay, well, how far can we take this before it becomes a problem? That type of stuff. So I become very fascinated. I start thinking about just very different things. That's where my mind goes. Is there any trends that you're seeing today that kind of mimic history or certain times of history? And I know I'm throwing a curveball at you.
No, I mean, one of the trends that, I'm not going to speculate with what is in somebody's mind and heart. But one of the trends that continues is the fact that a lot of these regulations have a fee associated with them in terms of like permitting, taxes, all of this stuff. And so, historically, forever, firearms laws have been classist. And so, they tend to impact whether purposefully, like we know happened in the South, or not purposefully. You end up impacting people in a certain demographic who can't necessarily afford those things. So you're inadvertently or advertently, pricing out a whole population of people who can't afford the ability to now defend themselves or even just afford to target shoot or, afford to go hunting. We don't even have to get into how expensive hunting can get. So that's a trend that kind of continues, is this idea that like we impose fees, but the only people you're really hurting are people that you're also, and I'm speaking specifically of political parties that tend to try to support, lower income families and that kind of thing. And you end up totally preventing them from being able to afford that or having to make the choice of how to save to afford that. And so that's something that, has been around, forever. Back in with the royalty, it was pretty sure that it was nepotism, like that was pretty clear. So that's something that's a trend that continues. Obviously, the trend of trying to regulate certain firearms features is a more recent, recent history, being like the last 150 years, with a few random cases that happened centuries earlier. But, that's something that, is a trend that's continuing. And then, it's just, in terms of a lot of the laws that occur today that aren't necessarily firearms related, but background check related, red flag laws, all of that thing, all of those different types of things that get proposed, is that, it all seems to follow the way government entities and courtrooms have been since the beginning, which is the assumption that people who would be participating in this are all good people. And so the unintended consequences of those who are affected by these laws, who may need them the most. And so that's something that is not just firearms oriented, but everything oriented. And that's been, around forever. If you look at the South, especially, sorry, I'm picking on the South a lot. I'm a Yankee. Okay. I'm from the North. Like if you look at the South, I mean, obviously keeping guns out of the hands of Black people, was dangerous. Black people needed firearms, especially in the South with lynchings. After the Civil War, it was incredibly violent. And then you have activists like I.W. Wells, who there's that quote that everybody quotes about the Winchester rifle should be the pride and joy of every Black home in America. And the end of that quote is something to the extent of to provide safety that the government will not provide. So that idea of creating something, and then, completely, screwing over the people who need them most in that moment, whether purposeful or not. It's just, that's always been around. The background check system's more modern, but, comes with its own shorter historical lineage. And it affects collectors. So that's, and collectors are old, so they're kind of a part of history. I mean, I'm a collector too, but for the most part, they're old, they're part of history. So there you go.
That's I always laugh whenever they push the background checks, because I'm like, if there's one thing the government always does, it's screw up. So with background checks, there's always, as repressive as they make it, there's gonna be the things that fall through the cracks, and it's gonna happen.
Well, the background check system, from my knowledge, and this is not coming from a historical perspective, but this is more of John Lott's area than it is mine. But the background check system is inherently, faulty in the ways that they search people who are trying to buy guns. And so, I heard him speak at one point that said basically like, listen, you can support universal background checks, but before you support them, why don't we reform the background check system so that, we're starting from a place where at least it's not too effed up, in terms of that. Because I was unaware before hearing him speak at, actually, I think it was the DC Projects session, all of the different parts of the background check system, which are inherently flawed, and set up in a way that also affects people who can't necessarily afford to go to court and fight, their name popping up that's similar to somebody else's who can't own firearms.
Well, I do want to make sure, because I'm taking up so much of your time. I do want to make sure that you get a chance to plug all the stuff that you're involved in and how people can support you. So if you can, go ahead and do those, and then we'll wrap things up.
Yeah. So if you want to follow what I'm doing, I don't like Twitter, so don't follow me on Twitter, because I think it's been years since I posted. But you can find me on Instagram. I'm at History and Heels. And then on Facebook, I'm at official Ashley Levinsky. I will warn you, though, if you follow me, you get a little bit of firearms history, a little bit of whiskey history, crime history, as well as photos of my dog and my extensive love of food and making up my own recipes. So you get a little bit of everything. If you want to do just firearm stuff, you can go to the Cody Firearms Museum social media. It's at Cody Firearms Museum on Facebook and Instagram, at Cody Firearms on Twitter. We do have a Reddit account, so we pop up on our guns from time to time. And then if you want to know about my consulting, I'm at theguncode.com. And right now, I'm just doing anything firearms history related. So I'm an adjunct scholar for the Firearms Policy Coalition. I'm doing expert for witness testimony whenever they call, they being lots of law firms. I'm doing writing. I write for Recoil. I still do a lot of television producing, as well as on camera. So if it's gun history related, I'm working on it probably in some capacity.
Well, no, that's great. And I really do appreciate you coming on here today. There's a lot of things that I think I would like to talk to you about more in depth. I really enjoyed our conversation. So if you're ever willing to come back, I will give you an open invite. I know our guests, our fans love guns, so they're gonna just love this interview. I know I'm gonna hear a lot of feedback about it already.
I hope so.
Well,
That'll depend on if I come back or not.
Well, I was having a couple drinks yesterday at our St. Patrick's Day celebration. I told a couple veterans that I was going to be interviewing you today, and they were really excited, and they wanted to know, like, oh, well, ask about this. I was like, we'll do a later interview on that stuff.
Yeah, definitely. I'd love to come back on. We could speak more specifically on different, like a specific bill, so it's not just like
absolutely, or even a specific firearm. If there's something like that you want to talk about, I'm happy to have you back. I think this was a great conversation for the fans. Again, or no, we already went through your plugs. So your Instagram is History and Heels.
Yeah.
And the official Ashley Levinsky.
Just official Ashley Levinsky.
Okay.
No
official. Okay. Well, thank you for joining us today. For all of our fans, again, I'm going to remind you, for our show, you can come back here on to www.nrnplus.com/VN, all spelled out. You can join for $9.95 for the month or $79.95 for the year, and you can support all the independent content that we provide here. And as always, for all of our fans, thank you for being worth serving.